This is Ben Allen, founder of BC Allen Publishing Group and Tonic Books, a partnership publishing house. We made this interview for you. Why? Because it is our mission to usher into existence the world's next great wave of life-changing, world-altering books. One of those books could be inside you right now, and no writer can go from idea to bestseller alone. No writer has to. Be sure to check out the other resources we've created for aspiring and established authors and the dozens of interviews we've done with some of the world's best, brightest, and most successful New York Times bestselling authors, world-impacting movement builders, and influencers that reach millions of lives. Do enjoy. I'm here with Michael Neill, and I've got Michael's bio. I've also studied your work a little bit. I came across your TED Talk, the Why Aren't We Awesomer video, maybe like 3.5 years ago. I forget. It's been a while now. And I really loved it. And that's where I got first exposure to your work. And then having worked with Steve for so long, I've come across your material again and again. And I've read a bunch of your books, The Inside Out Revolution, and The Space Within. And now I've got Creating the Impossible sitting on my desk, which is truly a wonderful book. And yeah, man, I really look forward to talking through your stuff. I'm going to read your bio here and then we'll jump in. So
great.
Michael Neill is an internationally renowned transformative coach and the best-selling author of The Inside Out Revolution and The Space Within. He has spent over 25 years as a coach, advisor, friend, mentor, and creative spark plug to celebrities, CEOs, royalty, and people who want to get more out of themselves and their lives. His books have been translated into 17 languages, and his public talks, retreats, and seminars have touched and transformed lives in the United Nations and on 6 continents around the world. Michael's weekly radio show, Living from the Inside Out, has been a listener favorite on Hay House Radio for over a decade. His TEDx talk, Why Aren't We Awesomer, has been viewed by over, 200,000 people around the world. We can follow him on Twitter and Facebook and get access to the Caffeine for the Soul podcast at michaelneill.org. I'll repeat that stuff again at the end of the call. But yeah, super excited to have you here, man. Thank you so much for your time.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Well, so I've got a ton of questions about the book, and I've got a ton of questions about it. We interviewed Dicken Bettinger as well. So I think like talking about creativity in the context of the 3 principles is just so valuable. I think there's so much there in terms of all the kind of ways of understanding and working with the mind. I think that's one of the most powerful. Will you tell us a little bit about how do the 3 principles show up for you in your creative process? I know that this book has got a ton of material on that, but I'm wondering about, as I was reading, I kept thinking like, how does this show up for Michael? And you have little stories about it, but yeah.
Well, so I think, are we working on the assumption that people have any idea what the 3 principles are? Or
that's a good point. Let's start with that. Let's actually give a brief definition of that. You do a really great job of explaining it very, very quickly or simply.
No pressure.
Well, maybe that doesn't work. I mean, if that's
essentially the framework that I work from in my coaching and in most of what I do, is something that we tend to shortcut by calling it the 3 principles, and it's a way of describing the forces in play when we create. So there's essentially 3 things that are always going on. There is thought. So people think, right? Not rocket science here, but the fact that we are always thinking, that we are actually living in thought, turns out to be ridiculously significant, because we think we're living in a real world that might be slightly filtered by our thinking, whereas actually we're living in a thought-created world. But in order to function, consciousness makes it all seem completely real. So it's like consciousness is the special effects department. And so we're in a movie, but we don't know that we're in a movie. That's what makes it such a good movie. And that again, it turns out to be really helpful to know that, because if you know that you're in a movie, it's sort of like the Matrix is the analogy most people can kind of get. You can do things, you can take risks, you can do a lot of things that you wouldn't do if it wasn't a movie. Or I'm a video game guy, so you can use the same kind of analogy. There are risks I take playing Call of Duty that I simply would not take in my own life. Well, when your life starts looking more like Call of Duty than it does like actually being at war, there's a lot of freedom in that. There's a lot of play in that. There's a lot of confidence in that. So thought is one of the principles. Consciousness is one of the principles, that which brings thought to life. And then we tend to call the third principle mind. I sometimes call it the God principle or the creative principle. And that's essentially just recognizing that there is an underlying creativity, there is an underlying intelligence, there's an underlying energy behind all things. Don't know what it is, don't know how it works, but without it, grapefruit seeds wouldn't always turn into grapefruit trees, and bodies wouldn't do whatever it is they're designed to do to heal themselves, and gravity wouldn't work the way that it does, and our creativity wouldn't be as reliable as it actually is. And knowing that there is a reliable intelligence stroke creative force behind the scenes, it lets us relax into our creativity more, which makes the whole game of writing and creating so much easier.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and I picture as well, like, you know, the year I've written for years on and off, and I picture myself and a lot of the writers I've worked with, like, being really stuck in a thought, right? Really stuck in criticism, or really stuck in some kind of pessimistic view of what's going to happen with the material, and believing that thought is reality, like inhabiting that thought, like this is never going to work, or I'll never get it done, or this is all terrible. Without, and if they're stuck inside of that, their creativity is completely like kinked off, like a hose.
Well, right, it is, and you know, that whole kink in the hose metaphor, I think, is quite a good one. You know, the problem isn't with the water flow. The problem is there are kinks in the hose, and the kinks in the hose are all those things that. And it's funny because people hear thought and they go, so what do I think instead? The whole point is the thoughts that really mess you up are the ones that don't look like thought. They look like, well, no, that's just real. I mean, it just is tough out there. I mean, creativity just is limited. I mean, some days you got it, some days you don't. I mean, you know, there's 40,000 books being, you know, coming out every year. What, you know, how's mine possible? You know, those things sound like reality to us. Yeah. Whereas actually, no, they're part of the thought created universe that we're in. And so it's actually waking up to just how much of your reality is made of thought that does it for people, not trying to think better thoughts.
That's really good. Yeah, yes, absolutely. And this is such a valuable, significant thing in the personal development sphere, especially. I mean, I know in my background, I spent so much time, you know, with NLP and these different technologies trying to like change my thinking, like as if there was something that really needed to be altered.
No, I mean, I was considered one of the world's leading NLP trainers for 18 years. You know, I taught with Richard Bandler. I taught huge seminars around the world. And so for me, it was a shock to the system to realize that when I stopped working so hard to control my thinking, this sort of underlying intelligence just brought better, more creative, more helpful thoughts to mind by itself.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's like why the Greeks had gods representing creativity, right? There's this kind of presence that feels like it's bigger than us.
Yeah, and anyone who's you know, we're all kind of surprised by our writing at times where we go, really? I wrote that? I mean, actually, my favorite instance of it was the very first piece of. So I started out as a ghostwriter. And then I did ghostwriting, and then I did some book editing, and then when I started writing my own, you know, first blog back was it in 2000? It was in 2000, and so the very first thing that I created though was a CD program that was called The 7 Myths of Success, and I had been basically offered by a producer who knew one of the people I'd ghosted for. And said, hey, do you have your own stuff? And I said, oh, sure. And he said, okay, well, I'd love to record you, you know, one of your programs. Oh, no, yeah, great. And then I, thinking to myself, well, I'll write it before I record it. And then he was like, okay, well, I've got a studio booked next week. So suddenly I've got just a few days to come up with a program that I'm supposed to already have. And I mean, I'd been teaching, so I wasn't really starting with absolutely nothing, but I had no content. So I wrote the script, and by the time we were recording, I'd only gotten through the first 4 scripts, and it was obviously 7 myths. So I was kind of stuck with the idea of 7. So I figured that's fine. It'll take at least the first day to record the first 4. So I'll write the last 3 overnight. And the problem was the recording went really well. So we were done with the first 3 at lunchtime, and I'm panicked. And I start stuttering and messing up the 4th recording. And finally around 2:30, 3 o'clock, the guy said, you know what, I think, we're better off just picking up tomorrow. And I was like, yeah, okay, let's do that. And so I stay at the voiceover studio to write. And I'm writing, and it's not coming. And I pick up just a script that's sitting around on the floor, and a page, and I read it, and it's so well written. It's so clean. And I think to myself, wow, I don't know who I'm kidding. That's what a writer writes like. And this was all in a daze of tiredness and stress, but I suddenly realized it was my own script. It was just, I was comparing my rough draft to a finished edit and thinking, oh, well, I don't know, this is crap and that's great. Forgetting that, there's a process to writing. The first iteration is rarely the best. It's just the first. And that was really helpful to me, funnily enough, once I got over it, to see is that, I don't have to worry so much about the first iteration or the second or the third. My first book, actually, I did 13 drafts. The publisher, the one I submitted to the publisher was 162,000 words, and the published version wound up being about 80. Wow.
That's amazing. Yeah. I love those stories. That's really, fantastic. So, and this is early on in your career when you had this moment in the recording studio, right?
Oh yeah, this was in the 90s. This was, like I said, I'd done some ghosting at that point, but I hadn't written anything in my own name.
So what was it like? Did you have access to you had, this is before your kind of exposure to 3 Principles stuff. So did you have, but you kind of had access to this, like the knowledge of creative, or that was the moment maybe that you saw, wow, I actually have this creative capacity that's just kind of laying there. And I don't need to actually force this.
I actually think I used to do creative writing in high school, right? I did a creative writing class, and my philosophy papers at university, my analysis of Freud's Civilization and its Discontents was an essay where a philosophy student gets trapped in an elevator with a cockroach who comes to life and argues that it's incumbent on the philosophy student to kill him for the betterment of civilization. So I always enjoyed tapping into creativity in writing. And what actually happened was in the 94, I was asked to write some sketches for a radio comedy, a BBC radio comedy called 30 Something Else. And I loved doing that so much. I told my wife, this is it. I'm going to be a writer. And then I didn't write another word for 6 years.
Oh, wow.
So I must have another word, but I didn't write. So I found it. I told my wife. I even sent off for a correspondence course in writing because I thought that would help me develop a discipline and all this crap. And I just didn't. So at some level, I knew from high school that I could tap into this creative force. I just didn't know what it was. And so that was really, coming across the Principles about 10 years ago, it explained to me why I was really good at this when I was really good at this, and why I was terrible at it when I was terrible at it.
And how would you describe that? Like, if you could put that into a short understanding for us. So when is it that you're
I can get out of my way, and I don't think this is a me thing. I think this is a human being thing. When we can get out of our way, we can get out of our heads, we can get out of self-consciousness, we can get out of how am I doing. It opens up a space through which this creative force flows.
Yeah, that's great.
When
awesome.
we're in our heads, when we're worrying about how we're doing, when we are self-conscious, when we're thinking about how will this sell, how will this be read, how will it be this, we're filling that channel up with our own personal thoughts, and there's no space for the creative force, or there's relatively little space for the creative force.
Yeah.
So the act of creative engagement is really the act of getting your head out of your ass for a little while.
Yeah, that's great. I really love it. And that's really what creating the impossible, that's a lot of what's in creating the impossible, the book. So,
well, it is. I mean, to be honest, one of the things I struggled with in writing it, and this is, you know, I'm really happy with how it came out, but it took a lot longer than a lot of my other books took me to write, is in essence, it could have been a kind of a 2-page book, and it would have been, you know, you are creative, get your head out of your ass and start creating, and you'll be surprised at what comes.
Right. I love that.
But,
Yeah,
but unfortunately, I found that people don't believe me when I say that.
Well, it's because we're still.
So I created a 90-day program and a lot of stories, and
right.
when people get through the program, they go, oh yeah, all I really need to do is get my head out of my own ass and start creating, and stuff will happen, and it'll be cool.
That's so good. Yeah, that's really great. I you know, well, part of that, I think it's just that the understanding, for whatever reason, the kind of the insight that people talk about having in relationship to the kind of 3 principles way of understanding is like that, you know, if we weren't so attached to our thoughts, a 2-page book would be all it was needed. Right? Like if we didn't believe our thoughts so much, a 2-page book that says you're creative, get out of your own way, that would be it. We'd be fine. But we need a lot of massaging sometimes, it seems like.
We do, and sometimes it's as simple as you don't hear it. It looks so obvious that you can't believe anyone ever could not hear it.
Yeah, right.
Right. So it's almost random what somebody hears that triggers the insight. Everyone has roughly the same insight, which is, oh, this is built in. This is inherent. I already have this. I don't need to go get it. But what causes somebody to have it, you know, it could be my book. It could be driving behind a beer truck and suddenly seeing a deeper meaning in their logo.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, right. But just kind of being present to that and staying in that and slowing down our thinking or whatever it is. But just being in that kind of conversation, it helps to create that kind of insight, it seems like. I mean, the more I'm immersed in your work and like,
I think it definitely does, because I think most conversations about creative blocks, let's say, are either trying to focus on the psychology of the block or are trying to focus on just do it. And just do it is great when it works. And sometimes it does, but a lot of times it doesn't. And psychology is just messy. So, you know, if you try and address a creative block through psychology, you're liable to be in therapy for a very long time.
Right.
You know, I use the analogy of a stick stuck in a river. It doesn't need therapy. It needs a nudge back into the flow of the river. And most people I've worked with, songwriters and book writers and movie writers, and you know, when they get stuck, they don't need deep psychological cleansing. They need a nudge back into the flow of their own creativity.
That's really good. How do you provide that nudge? And I would love to hear a little bit about your own experience as well. How do you provide that nudge to yourself?
Well, really, the thing that most often I think helps is to just get somebody's mind off it. You know, the problem, everyone thinks they're not as creative or not as creatively expressed or not as productive as they could be because they're not trying hard enough. And I'd say 95% of the people I work with are trying too hard. You know, they're trying to make it happen.
Right.
They're trying to be creative. Well, we're not creative. Creativity is, and we can tap into it. We can dance with it. We can ride it. We can open ourselves up to be a vehicle for it. It's a much more feminine process than masculine. And And so consequently, it's when people, generally speaking, it's when people try to get all macho with it, male or female, and they try and make it happen, that they get more and more stuck. So very often it's a case of just getting somebody's mind off it, getting them to take the gun away from their head, right? That's a notion a lot of people have is, oh, I write better with a gun to my head. They don't call it that. They say, I write better with a deadline.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, no, you don't. You probably do write better when you're focused and when you're present to what you're doing and you're not distracted by 1,000 things. And for a lot of people, having a deadline, me too, by the way, is helpful for that. But as soon as you start taking the deadline seriously, as soon as you, like I share in the book, in Creating the Impossible, the Douglas Adams quote. He was the guy who wrote the Hitchhiker's Guide books and the Dirk Gently detective series, and just a wonderful, humorous, and prolific writer. And he said, I love deadlines. I love that whooshing sound they make when they fly by. That's a healthy relationship with deadlines. It's not that they can't be useful. It's that if you really do think that you're dead if you don't cross that line in time, that's going to stifle your creativity, not unleash it.
Yeah, absolutely. It puts another kink in the hose. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, really good, really fascinating stuff. I love that. You talk in the book about that masculine, feminine kind of circle of doing and being, and I really like that a lot. There's so much more to explore in this topic itself, and I want to also hear a little bit about like what you think is like strong writing. So you've worked on some books. My understanding is that you helped to edit the I Can Make You ... sort of series. And those
That's
books
right. Yeah, no, I was Paul's editor for most of those books.
Yeah, and those books are sold 7 million.
To 7 million.
Yeah. So tell us about that. Like, how do you know? Do you know when you're on? And you've also written multiple bestsellers yourself, and like you've really built a wonderful, admirable career as an author that is helping change people's lives, and it's really, I think, wonderful. And so, like, what? Yeah, I want to hear more about that. Like, what do you think is strong writing? Do you know when you're sitting on an idea that's like this could really land, or how do you know when you've got writing in front of you that you're like this could really land? Like, or maybe you don't know. Maybe it's all experimentation. But I love. Well,
I think there is a lot of experimentation in it. So I started blogging before I knew it was called blogging. I started writing a daily blog back in 2000, and after the first year I went to weekly, and I'm now 18 years in to that. We're on like number 1100 and something.
Oh wow.
And so there was something about the daily practice and then the weekly practice of bringing something into being from nothing, from beginning to end, that you do make distinctions. And I think sharing it with the world, you also start to see, or at least what I saw is, there was stuff that I loved that people thought was fine, stuff that I thought was just fine that people loved, and every combination in between. And so in the end, yes, you do develop an intuition for what will work, but I think you really do have to please yourself. I think if you don't love your writing, you're kind of doomed.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't guarantee that if you love your writing, other people will too.
Right.
In the end, so this is what happened. So my first book, I told you it was 160,000 something like that words, and they brought in an editor who they said, "Oh, you'll love this editor. They're they're going to really get you. They were a stand-up comic, so your humor will come across and blah blah blah." And he proceeded, in my mind, to hack the book and to make it sound like every other book that was out there, when part of the point of my first book, You Can Have What You Want, was it was actually a genuinely different take on success. So, for example, like there was a chapter in that book called The Secret of Letting Go for It, which doesn't quite parse, but what it was about was that there's this balance between the masculine and the feminine, between going for it and letting go. And he just changed the title to The Secret of Letting Go because that made sense to him. And he took a lot of what I think of as the music. My writing has always been very conversational, and he made it read like a self-help book. Now, he edited some best-selling self-help books, so there was a logic to it. But it hit the point where it wasn't my book anymore.
Hmm.
And I actually wrote and our communication broke down completely. And I wrote a letter, a 6-page letter. It's probably better than the book, to the publisher, and I said to them, I said, hey, I've read through my contract. I understand that contractually you can do whatever you want with the manuscript. There are now 2 versions of this book, mine and the editor's. I said, the story that came to mind when I read his latest version was a story about when Warren Beatty produced Bonnie and Clyde, which was the first movie that he produced and directed as well as starred in.
Mm-hmm.
And he loved the movie Shane. It's a long story, but you'll get there. The movie Shane was this Western with Alan Ladd from the 50s. And Warren Beatty had loved that movie. And one of the things about the way they made Shane was that they doubled the volume on all the gunshots so that the gunshots would really scare the audience if they were double the volume of the movie. And so when he made Bonnie and Clyde, he did the same thing. So they have the first out-of-town preview, and all the big movies used to preview in DC. And, everyone's at it, and Warren Beatty's in the front row, and the first gunfight comes up, and the bullets aren't popping. And he gets out of his seat, runs to the back of the theater, runs up to the projection booth, and there's this old guy up there, and he says, the guy goes, "Oh, Mr. Beatty, what's wrong?" And he said, "There's something wrong with the sound." And the old timer says, "Oh, no, I go through and I know how important these out of town showings are. So I went through before the movie, and I checked all the sound myself, and I realized that there were these weird glitches in the sound where the volume would suddenly change. So I went in and manually changed the volume on all of to even it out." And then as an afterthought, he said, I haven't actually seen a movie this badly mixed since Shane."
That's awesome.
So I share this story and I say, look, if you go with my book, I will get behind it 100% and do everything I can to help it get out into the world. If you go with this other book that has my name on it, I can't get you to take my name on it, but I won't be able to get behind it. Over to you. And I mean, it was like written in blood. I mean, I was so angry. And being a British publisher, they sent me a 1-paragraph note back the next day that essentially said, "We gather that you have not been entirely satisfied with our choice of editor. Please know we shall be publishing your manuscript sincerely." And that was the beginning for me of just kind of getting. I don't know if the other book would have sold better. I mean, we became a #1 bestseller in the UK, so we sold well enough. Mm-hmm. But it didn't matter. Having a #1 bestseller that wasn't my book would have been way worse than if the book had tanked, but it was still a book that I was proud of.
Yeah, it's really great. Yeah, and part of that is, just to circle back, is like loving the writing yourself, really like being sure that you can stand behind what's in there and that it's you.
Well, and one of my son's high school English teachers really helped me out with that. Mm-hmm. Books I ghosted and some of the books that I edited, when I used to edit Paul's books, he used to say, "We're writing for Doris." Doris was this imaginary character who was a housewife in the middle of England, and Paul would go, "Doris isn't going to understand that. We need to make this so Doris gets it." And so there was a sort of a reading level, and I never did. There are tests that show you the grade reading level, but there was a deliberately lower grade reading level to the books that we did together, and of course they were huge, as I say, multi-million copies bestsellers. And so when my books were only selling tens of thousands and not millions, I went through a thing where I thought, well, maybe I need to do what we're doing on these books, and I need to kind of simplify it down. So for Doris, but see, I love words. Mm-hmm. Like for myself, I'm of the why use one word if I can use 10. Right? I love language.
Yeah.
So I kind of was in a dilemma. My natural writing is much more flowery and ornate and a much higher grade level. Mm-hmm. That for some people reads as a bit pretentious and exclusive, and I understand that. But so I went into Oliver's English class for parent-teacher night. Mm-hmm. He was a freshman in high school, and the English teacher said, She said, look, there's two ways to teach English, lowest common denominator and highest common denominator. I teach highest common denominator, which means I get them to read things that are probably too hard for them. I get them to write things that are probably beyond their ken. But I don't mind if they struggle. I don't hold them accountable to that. I want to appeal to the highest common denominator in them. And most kids will rise to it. And a few will get left behind, but no, if that's your kid, I'll spend extra time with them and blah, blah, blah. Well, that was what I needed to hear.
That's great.
I just thought, well, look, I'm going to write highest common denominator instead of lowest. And some people it will be too flowery and clever for. And other people are going to absolutely love it. And most people probably won't even care because they're more interested in what's being said than how it's being said. And that became my sort of guiding principle is, do I love it? And I don't even let my wife read drafts of my books. She's not allowed to read it till it's published. Reason being, I care so much what she thinks that if she read it early and rolled her eyes or didn't laugh when I thought it was funny, I would rewrite the whole book to try to please her. And I just know that would be death, so I just don't let her read it.
That's great. Yeah. Well, you learn that over time. Like you learn your kind of triggers, I guess, as a writer. So do you
and look, she actually just read Creating the Impossible. She finished it just before it came out on Monday, and she loved it. So
nice.
There's that.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And I've got a couple more questions about the. So in terms of the simplicity of the writing for Doris, as you were saying with the I Will Make You series, like do you think that's part of what made those sell? Like what makes a book sell that many copies? Or is it totally kind of chance? Like, is there something that you can?
I think there's a lot more chance in it than any of us would like to admit. The first book that I did with Paul sold 50,000 copies because Paul's kind of famous over there. And it was good. It was really good. The second book, when it crossed the 1 million copy line, we both were like freaked out. Like there was no version of reality where we had thought that book was 20 times better than the first book. It's gone on to sell over 6 million copies, so it hit a nerve. But part of that book was how short it was. It's actually longer. The original version that we put out was 17,000 words.
Wow, it's
and
tiny.
Yeah. And especially back then, this was over 10 years ago. Nobody was doing it. And Paul actually got a letter back from his publisher when we submitted the book saying, "We have received your pamphlet. It's very nice. We look forward to receiving the rest of the book in due course." Paul's a pretty cool customer, but he freaked out and he was like, "What are we going to do? What do we need to add?" And I've always loved Paul for this, but I said to him, "Paul, we can make it longer, but it won't be better." And I said, "Let me do this." And I wrote a line, and I don't think the line is in the book anymore because, as I say, the book has gradually had chapters added to it over the years. But I wrote a line at the very beginning of the book, and the line was something like, I don't remember it exactly, "This may be the thinnest book on weight loss that you've ever read, but I think you'll agree, thin is good, and it's what's inside that really matters." And literally, that was the only addition to the book. We resubmitted it, and it went on to, as I say, sell over 6 million copies. And now there's all sorts of that are that kind of length.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And that came back to a confidence that we were saying what we wanted to say in the way that we wanted to say it.
Yeah. So confidence,
and not trying to do what other people thought would make it a better seller. Same thing has happened with my book with the editor, where maybe the way he was writing it was better, but it wasn't ours. It wasn't mine in that case.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, it's really fascinating. That's really interesting. So do you have, in terms of like thinking about that, like it's kind of every author's dream, right? To sell a book, to sell millions of copies of a book. Maybe not every author's, but a lot of authors look at that and kind of water at the mouth.
Well, I still feel inadequate because of how well. Like I do, I'm like that became. I had to get over that because that became my benchmark, and so I've got all these books that are bestsellers and sell tens of thousands of copies. And for years, I beat myself up about the fact that I was a failure because that was my standard of comparison.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's really interesting. And so what would be your advice to folks like that who are like kind of sitting there with an idea, or maybe they've got a manuscript and they're ready to shop it around and they're like, I want to sell millions of copies. Is there something that, what would you give them in terms of advice? Both in terms like,
well, look, I want a pony. I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with wanting it, and there's nothing wrong with doing stuff that you think will help it sell.
Yeah.
But ultimately, see, I think you can market your way to 100,000 sales. I'm making that number up.
Yeah, it's great.
But like, I think if you were an aggressive internet marketer, you could probably sell, and 100,000 is probably at really high end. I think probably more like 10.
Yes.
10,000. Yeah. But you can, and that's a testament to your marketing.
Mm-hmm.
That's nothing to do with your book.
Mm.
Now, what I realized pretty early on is I didn't want to be a great marketer. I wanted to be a great writer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if my book sells 1 million copies because I was so clever at how I marketed it, good for me, probably good for my bank balance, but honestly, I wouldn't feel any particular measure of pride with that.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
My book sells 1 million copies because people love it and talk about it and can't stop talking about it. That's the way I want to get to 1 million.
Yeah, that's really great.
I want the book to do it. I don't want my clever marketing to be the reason. So I'm not saying don't market. I obviously market. Every author I know does some marketing. But if the marketing starts becoming more important than the book, I think you've lost your way. Certainly as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely.
You may not have lost your way as a business person. I get that for a lot of people, writing a book is a business move.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just happen to love it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I talk about that with authors. It's like really the ultimate thing that you want to be doing is paying attention to creating an extraordinary product that people, like you said, that people talk about, that really powerfully changes their lives. And then it'll become a perennial seller that way. If it really connects.
And that's the difference. One of the things that you don't realize going in, I certainly didn't realize going in, is that there's an ego hit that you get for doing well out of the box. But if your book disappears 3 months later into a back catalog, there's 1 million books like that out there.
Oh, yeah.
For me, I'm much more interested in writing books that are still around 10 years from now, that still maybe are around 50 years from now. And that's a sort of a different end game.
Yeah.
It's not to be able to put #1 bestseller on your website.
Right.
It's to write something to go, holy crap, The Artist's Way changed my life 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Holy crap, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People changed the way I think about business 20 years ago. That for me is the direction to aim.
Yeah, that's great.
And that's about impact and not about marketing.
And the ways to measure impact, at least a little bit of what we talked about here, and maybe you've got more to add to this, but part of the way to measure impact is how does this land for me, right? Is this something that I really need to say or something I really want to say? Is there more? What else do you look at when you're trying to create impact with your writing?
So it's interesting. The dedication to creating the impossible, and I really wrestled with this, I struggled with it a bit, is to Michael, age 17. This is the book I wish we could have read back then.
Yeah, you have that in the opening. I love that. Yeah.
It felt a little arrogant and egotistical or whatever it was to dedicate a book to myself, even at a younger age. But actually, the truth was, this was the book that I wish I read when I was starting out. This is what I wish I'd known back then. And so, the first person who has to get impacted is you, Steve Chandler. I know you referenced already. He quotes Robert Frost a lot. No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader.
Nice. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of the same thing. If it doesn't impact you, there's no reason to think that it will impact other people. If it impacts you, that doesn't guarantee it will impact other people, but it's a good start.
Yeah, that's really good. And is there anything else? I also noticed we're winding up towards the end of the call here, but is there anything else in terms of impact that you think is that you consciously bake into your writing process?
No, but I do. Once I've written it to a certain point, I do like to get some people to read it.
Mm-hmm.
So with my first book, it was interesting. It was probably one I was most deliberate with, and because I wanted, so I deliberately picked a priest, an atheist, a scientist, a New Ager, a very successful business person, and someone who was just starting out. I think there were 8 of them.
Sounds like
I tried
the line to a joke.
The full range of people who might come across the book, because I wanted to hear how it landed for each of them.
That's great. Yeah, interesting.
And what was cool about that was there were certain things that landed well for all of them. And there were some bits that some of them liked and others hated. And that then gave me a sort of a reference point to go back and see, well, what mattered to me? And I could build on the things that resonated with everyone. And I recognized there were a few things that some people hated, but I didn't care because they were essential to me. Mm-hmm. And there were other things that nobody particularly liked that was like, oh, okay, so I don't need to keep that in.
Yeah, that's great.
So I'm a big fan of rewriting is essentially kind of, so that first book, 13 drafts, Inside Out Revolution was only 3 drafts, but the final version, I did a word check at one point, has like 45% of the original content is in the final version.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah, so I'm very, very open to rewriting and rewriting and rewriting until it is what I'd like it to be as best I can.
And part of the way that you rewrite is in response to hearing like what universally applies, like what universally lands for people from this book, or at least that's the method you've used.
Up to a point. I think as I've written more, I've been able to see that more directly. Mm-hmm. I kind of trusted that I didn't trust myself to know early on.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, that is definitely a skill, I think.
It's too close to it.
Yeah,
I have a better because I've been doing it longer.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Michael, I want to thank you for your time here, and I want to just like again sign off with you and saying like I've read the Creating the Impossible. The subtitle is a 90-day program to get your dreams out of your head and into the world. I absolutely love it. And one little thing that we didn't get to talk about, which I really would have loved to get to, is that having this kind of work, the stuff that you're talking about in this book and the 3 principles, like it actually provides for us even more productivity, right? It like provides for us even a great, like not only more joy in the process itself, but even more a stronger ability to perform at our best. And I absolutely love that. Yeah.
To me, it's what takes creating out of the realm of personal development. Like right. Even with this book, there were times where, I was up against deadlines and noticing that I wasn't terribly stressed, and I'd have a little conversation in my head, and it was like, wow, I'm not stressed at all. And another part of me would go, great, how's the book coming?
Yeah.
And then there would be other times, oh my God, I'm having a terrible time. I'm stressed through the roof. I go, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. How's the book coming?
Yeah, it's so good. You bring that up in so many different ways throughout the book. And I really love that you have that story about the golfers and just that, like our thinking, it doesn't matter necessarily what's going on in our heads as much as we think it does, right? That you can perform if your head is full of noise, and you can perform if you're still as a lake. It's great.
Right.
I love it.
And you will, and there's a really good chance over time that you'll experience both of those continually.
Yeah, it's good. I actually have one little quote here from the book, and then we're going to end. But it looks as though our feelings of optimism and pessimism are a reflection of how things are going and a predictor of future performance. But all they actually tell us is about our current thinking. I think that's like such powerful advice for writers, especially new writers who are sitting there at the edge of their computer with the blank screen in front of them, just in a swirl of like inner noise. But just to remember, like that's got nothing to do with what's in front of you. That's got nothing to do with your book, really. That's just what's occurring inside of your consciousness at that one moment. And if you slow down and relax, that's going to change. And I absolutely love that message in your writing. And you write it so well, and it's very engaging and beautiful. And just thank you so much for
thank you.
And the last thing I like to do in these calls is if you had one, and maybe we've got there already, maybe you've already said it, but if there was one piece of advice you'd like to leave authors with who want to create, or aspiring authors with who want to create something remarkable in the world with their writing, what would that be? And again, we may have already said it, but it might be something new now.
There's a lot of different, I don't have a pat answer to it, but and we have talked about it, but I think the thing that occurs to me when I hear you ask the question clean is, if you want to write, and
Right.
don't worry about it. Like, don't worry about what'll come of it, where it will take you. If you get in the game will take you somewhere. We think of it as it's all going to be our volition. Really, the only bit that's particularly volitional is showing up.
Yeah, that's so good.
After that, we're on a ride, and there is literally no way to know where that ride will take you. Every time I start a new book, I literally don't know where it's going. Every time I finish a book and it comes out into the world, like is happening this week, I could not tell you where I will be 6 months from now with this book having just come out. It may be pretty much where I am now. It may be another world. I've experienced both with books. So worry about it. Just write.
That's so awesome. Yeah, I've got another quote right here lined up that relates to that. This was another quote I wanted to talk about, but the ultimate formula for success creation: 1, show up and begin moving in the direction of your dreams. 2, respond to what shows up. That's so perfect, man. Thank you so much for all the work that you do, Michael. What a pleasure it is to talk with you. Thank you.
No, thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me.
All right.
If you want more interviews like this, check us out at tonicbooks.online. In addition to other resources, we've made dozens of interviews like this to support aspiring and established authors who want to write, publish, and market their book with ease and impact. For more details, check out the description below.